Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Archaeology Hour lecture by Dr. David Carballo. I'm Joost Blom. I'm president of the AIA Vancouver Society, which is hosting tonight's lecture. And I'm professor emeritus of law at the University of British Columbia. Because the AIA Vancouver Society is the host this evening, I want to acknowledge that Vancouver is part of the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I also want to note that you in the audience are joining us from many places, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. The Vancouver Society was chartered in 1966, and it's affiliated with and supported by the Department of Ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern Studies of the University of British Columbia. We're the only Canadian AIA local society west of the Rockies, so we have members not just in Vancouver, but on Vancouver Island and in the interior of British Columbia. We hold 7 public lectures during the academic year, including the AIA National Lecture Program lecture. Last October, we also put on a special online event for International Archaeology Day, at which graduate and undergraduate students told of their fieldwork experiences during the past summer. After 2 years of being restricted to offering our lectures online, we happily returned to an in-person format last September, but we do offer Zoom access to the in-person lectures upon request. Our lectures this year have explored post-Mycenaean tombs in Thessaly, the effect of a 12th century BCE climate crisis on ancient Athens, museum catalogs and archaeological imagery in early 20th century Tunisia, excavations at a late Roman estate in Sicily, the archaeology of Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall in Britain, and the role of animals in the ritual practices of the Moche of Peru in the first millennium BCE. Our concluding lecture, as you can see on the slide, will be on April 4th, and the subject will be a project to develop a digital map of the surfaces of the Temple of Isis in Philae in Egypt, which, among other things, are covered with many hundreds of graffiti. Online Zoom access, if you're interested, to this in-person lecture is available on request. Please contact Megan Daniels, our program coordinator at the Vancouver Society, at the email address that is shown on your screen. If you are not already an AIA member, please consider joining. Your membership will help support the AIA's many activities, which are captured by the motto, excavate, educate, advocate. Membership includes a subscription to Archaeology magazine and affiliation with one of the more than 100 local AIA societies. All the information is on the AIA website that is indicated on the slide. And of course, in addition to becoming a member, we encourage you to donate to the AIA's annual fund if you can, which is a major source of the AIA's financial capacity to accomplish its goals every year. Just a reminder that this is a live presentation that is being recorded by the AIA. Recording by attendees is strictly prohibited. The AIA respects the intellectual property of its presenters and asks that viewers do the same. And thank you very much for your cooperation. And just before I introduce David Carballo, I'd like to note that you members of the audience can use the Q&A function in order to pose questions, and you can enter those questions during the lecture as well as afterwards. I'll put as many questions as we have time for to Dr. Carballo during the 20 minutes or so of Q&A period that we have scheduled after the lecture. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce David Carballo, professor of archaeology, anthropology, and Latin American studies at Boston University. He specializes in the archaeology of Latin America, especially central Mexico, and with topical interests in households, urbanism, religion, social inequality, and working with contemporary communities in understanding ancient ones. Current investigations focus on Teotihuacan's Tlajenga district, I apologize for mangling the pronunciation, a cluster of non-elite neighborhoods on the periphery of what was then the largest city in the Americas. His recent books include Cooperation and Collective Action, Archaeological Perspectives, Urbanization and Religion in Ancient Central Mexico, Teotihuacan, The World Beyond the City, and Collision of Worlds, A Deep History of the Fall of Aztec Mexico and the Forging of New Spain. And now I'll turn things over to Dr. Carballo.
Well, thanks so much, Joost, and thanks to everyone involved with putting this together, the lecture series coordinators at the AIA, our local host affiliates in Vancouver and associated with UBC. I'm going to share my screen right here. Okay, that's projecting. It's a pleasure to be involved with this lecture series. My own institution, Boston University, has very close ties with the AIA. In fact, we are fortunate to count some of our former students as employees of the association. And not only that, I'm of course a member of the AIA, and probably like a lot of people tuning in, I devour Archaeology magazine when a new issue arises. So today I'm going to be, whoops, just a sec. I will be giving a very abridged version. I don't know why this is not advancing. Try there. Okay. A very abridged version of a latest book project on the very momentous encounter in human history that you could say, and I would argue, was more responsible than any other for creating true globalization, for connecting the worlds of Europe, the Americas, and Asia, with all the good and bad that comes out of those historical processes and colonial processes associated with them. I'll emphasize three major themes. First, this being a fora for archaeologists, I think everyone appreciates an archaeological lens on things, and now that's not has not always been how this particular encounter, which can be framed in some cases as the conquista of Mexico or the Spanish-Aztec War, among other labels for it, typically has not been viewed in sort of a long-term diachronic process like archaeologists will take. But I will take that approach, and that was sort of, being an archaeologist, my approach to framing this encounter. So one that also focuses on materiality, the material world, the role of landscape, the role of things, circulation of things, and transformations in things. Secondly, this will be a transatlantic perspective, so considering both the similarities and the differences in trajectories in both Iberia and in Mesoamerica. And this has been done before, but tends to lean heavily on technological differences. So thinking of a book like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, it's a real focus on technology. And I'd instead like to emphasize, although I will not ignore technology, but try to emphasize some of the importance of cultural institutions, of historical memory, of the creation of societies and how they developed over time, especially when they came into contact in this one particular period. And then finally, framing agency or the ability to act strategically given certain constraints of power relations on the part of all people. So not just, say, Cortez as a great man narrative, but many other agents who are involved in this, Europeans and also indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica, the ability to negotiate, the ability to resist in certain cases. This, again, is a topic that has been frequently trod, and in fact, it's one of these historical encounters that was written about in real time. So we, of course, have Cortez's, the conquistador Hernando Cortez's letters that he was writing back to the King of Spain, Charles I, or Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Here are, without trying to be comprehensive, are just a few books that have influenced my thinking in different ways. So starting with the first two, Thomas's book, Conquest. This was when I was an undergraduate student first getting into Mesoamerican archaeology. And this book, and also Carlos Fuentes's The Buried Mirror, they came out in commemoration of the quincentennial of 1492. So they were early 90s productions. And Thomas's book is sort of a classic work of history, focusing on this pivotal period around 1519 to 1521, where Fuentes took a different tack in framing transatlantic history. And so he really was looking at the connections between Spain and Latin America, Mexico in particular. But then also works like Eric Wolf's ironically titled Europe and the People Without History. Here, Wolf's trying to make the point that these encounters are also often framed with native peoples being ahistorical, right? So oftentimes histories emphasize the history of the conquistadors, the memory that they drew on, especially the so-called Reconquista period, or the wars with Islamic kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula, but you often get the sense that the Aztecs and other Mesoamericans didn't really have much of a history until 1519. Then, having worked for a good number of years in the state of Tlaxcala, just east of Mexico City, I started to become aware, this is in sort of the late 90s into the early 2000s, of works like this one, the Historia de Tlaxcala, written by a native descendant of the Tlaxcaltecs, a group I'll be getting to, who wrote his own history of his own people in the 16th century. And so having this different lens that was a indigenous or mestizo lens on these same events. And then being a archaeologist, of course, working in Mexico, works like Manuel Gamio's of the early 20th century came onto my radar as the origins of Mexican archaeology. This was one of the first individuals, maybe the first, to ever dig stratigraphically in the Americas, and has many admirable traits to his work. Of course, it is a product of his time, and there are certain issues we would take with it today, but nevertheless, the foundation of a professional archaeology in Mexico. And then later works that one might call the new conquest history, starting in the 80s or 90s, with people like James Lockhart and others, some of his students, who really looked more critically at some of these developments. So we talk in archaeology about landscapes being palimpsests, and I think all are probably familiar with that and have been to archaeological sites where you see layers of history. And so part of this is framing those layers and what they tell us about these people, so say peoples of Castilian Spain and central Mexico, when they came into contact with one another. So here on the top left, you have the site of Medellin in Extremadura in Spain. And that's the site that the statue that you see in the middle of the plaza is Cortez himself, and this was his natal town. And on the bottom, you have what actually is the largest pyramid in the world in terms of mass at Cholula, Mexico. And these two sites were inextricably linked by the brutal massacre that Cortez led in Cholula. But they also are both products and show this layered history of the two sites. So you can see different eras of construction, and I'll go into that in a little more detail. Another site But we also think about things, about objects and artifacts. And so, for instance, more utilitarian things like pottery styles, and how when these two worlds came into contact, there was the creation of something new, a new Spanish style or a new Mexican style of pottery, or even really important ideological and religious concepts, like, for instance, the Virgin of Guadalupe, who was from Extremadura, not far from where Cortez grew up, and that fusion of that particular religious personage with feminine divine principles of central Mexico, like Tonantzin, the statue that you see on the right, an Aztec goddess figure. So first, starting on the Iberian Peninsula with a little bit of Mediterranean history that probably a lot of you in the AIA are familiar with. This, of course, the Iberian Peninsula could represent something akin to a hinge between two maritime worlds. There's the Mediterranean world, and then the Atlantic world, the North Atlantic world. And this, of course, started to be connected by people like the Phoenicians from the Eastern Mediterranean, who sailed past what the Greeks knew as the Pillars of Heracles, or the Romans Pillars of Hercules. But that's because the Phoenicians themselves built a temple to this divine hero figure, Melkart, well before those two later civilizations, and sailed their boats into the Atlantic, followed also by the Carthaginians. So, for instance, this petrograph that you see on the top here, that's from the northwest of Spain, the Celtic part of Atlantic Spain, registering one of these journeys. And then we have them from later periods, like in Carthaginian history as well. The Roman period, of course, was very pivotal to the formation of Hispania, Roman Hispania, and especially different wars of conquest associated with controlling important mineral resources. In that northwest corner, for instance, is the site of Las Medulas, this anthropogenic landscape created by the Romans, essentially using a technique like fracking to open up these cliff faces and mine gold. And for a while, this was the richest gold mine in the Roman Empire. So here, looking back at Medellin, Cortez's site, you can see this hill with this prominent castle fortress on it, or you can see a Roman bridge. You can see the layers of history here. So the Roman theater, and this church over here where Cortez was actually baptized in, is overlying a temple to Pluto. So those layers of history. There's also, of course, earlier history from the Tartessian period, which interacted with the Phoenicians, and then later history like the Christian and Islamic constructions on the top of this hill. Another important element to think about then are what sorts of institutions, not just the sort of infrastructure, the architecture that you see here, but what were the social institutions that were part of these waves of different colonizing forces across the Iberian Peninsula? And one is that empires like Rome are what we would call a direct control or territorial empire. They were They built infrastructure like roads and garrisons. They had heavy hands in the economy, like, for instance, controlling mineral resources. And cultural change could often be stronger in direct control empires. So, for instance, linguistic change and religion. And 15th and 16th century Spaniards drew on this Roman tradition very conspicuously. And a good example of this is Antonio de Nebrija, who wrote the first grammary of a contemporary European language in 1492, obviously a pivotal year for Spain, and gave it to the Queen Isabel and said, this is the tool of empire, that having a unified language, a unified linguistic sense, is a tool for empire building. Now, here you can see a map of Rome and Hispania and all of that. Again, that built infrastructure of a direct control empire, its road system. In fact, it's quite striking that other than Madrid, which of course was a later Islamic settlement, pretty much all of the major towns that you see in Iberia today were Roman centers. In some cases, earlier ones like Cadiz down there, that's where the Pillars of Hercules were in the earlier Phoenician settlement, but many of them had their infrastructure developed as Roman Hispania. And then as the first into the early second millennium of our era, there of course were the medieval wars between Christian and Islamic powers. And a lot of social institutions developed there too, that then were transplanted in Spain's imperial expansion into the Americas. Like, for instance, what was formerly a more peaceable pilgrimage site at Santiago de Compostela in northwest Spain became recast as a militarized Santiago the Moor Slayer, Matamoros, who then in the Americas became Santiago Mata Indios. So this sort of a religious concept that was important to Spain's colonialism and imperialism, but also its social and economic institutions, like having military roles of who was authorized to conquer or do military incursions, the adelantado, which translates as the front man, especially in frontier zones, as the Christian and Islamic frontier lands were being contested in this period. And then also institutions of indebted labor, like the encomienda. These are all things that the Castilians transplanted first to the Canaries, and then later to the Caribbean, and then later to Mesoamerica. And so these institutions also then have a very deep history. But it's important to note that Mesoamerica also had its deep history, and Mesoamericans drew conspicuously on this. So for instance, Cholula, again, this site with the largest pyramid by mass in the world, is actually, as is the case with many Mesoamerican pyramids, almost a millennia of accumulated construction. And so you can see on the bottom left the tunnels that archaeologists have excavated to document these different phases and how they've been dated to, and certain ones like the one on top, which is about the 1st century of our era, when this thing got really monumental as almost this acropolis, and what we call a pyramid has actually taken many different forms. And then on the top right is this wonderful rendition from a native map of the city of Cholula from a document called the Historia Tolteca Chichimeca, the history of the Toltec Chichimec history. And here, by this time in the 16th century, the pyramid that you see here with the church, the much later church on top of it, was covered in grass like you see here. And you can see that in the image on the top right, if you can see this grass-covered hill. I'm not sure if my cursor is noting that. At this time, there was another big pyramid that was dedicated to the feathered serpent that you see here. And then you also see all of the neighborhoods, or the Nahuatl term, the Aztec language term for these, were the big houses. They're these corporate family groups ringing the central plaza. And Cholula, we also know from this document and others, didn't just have a single ruler, it had co-rulers. It had 2 different rulers. Then it had sort of a person charged with internal affairs. So it almost had this tripartite rulership structure. And then at the bottom, it had a ruling council called the Turquoise House. So we know a lot about the governance structure of these polities. And we would say that they had a more indirect control or hegemonic state or imperial formation. These sorts of polities tend to work in terms of displaying hierarchical relations, power relations, to extract tax or tribute, but then ultimately having a more laissez-faire approach to economic exchange, and also weaker cultural change, religions that incorporate those of conquered people rather than trying to impose a single religion on them. And so these are some of the important contrasts between the Aztec and Mesoamerican worlds. Here at the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, right in the heart of what is today Mexico City today, we can very abundantly see these material ties that the people of Tenochtitlan, the Mexica, and so the Mexica is the ethnic group, it's where we derive the term Mexico from, who would incorporate objects from earlier civilizations. In some cases, the artifacts, like on the bottom left, you can see an Olmec mask that was some 2,000 to 3,000 years earlier than this construction, that was incorporated as an offering. But then in other cases, there's this very conspicuous hearkening to the earlier high civilizations of central Mexico. And so I like to tell students, think about the mall in Washington, DC, where you have buildings that mirror this Greco-Roman style. There's an Egyptian obelisk. That's what the Templo Mayor looks like. It's a very materials and architecture from earlier periods, like where I have done most of my work, Teotihuacan. There's a shrine that's in an archaic Teotihuacano style. There are benches to the Toltec capital of Tula that comes between Teotihuacan and the Aztecs or Tenochtitlan. And then the writing system really draws on earlier chapters of history. And I should say a lot of this work in particular has been done by my colleague Leonardo Lopez Lujan, the Mexican archaeologist who oversees the excavations at the Templo Mayor, but many others who have worked since the 1970s at exposing this particular site, the Great Temple of the Aztecs. So both civilizations on two sides of the Atlantic were actively engaging with their predecessors, and they molded their course of action and the way that they saw these events unfold very conspicuously with reference to them. And that learning was done formally in both cases. And so many probably know of the early European universities, some of the very earliest like Bologna and Paris and Oxford. In Spain, the earliest wasn't this one that you see on the right, Salamanca, but it was one of the earliest and it became the most prestigious. And Salamanca is where people like Cortes himself studied, and Cortes is believed to have seen a lecture that Columbus gave after returning to the university from the Americas. As well as some of the theologians who translated this encounter in religious terms and often had a much more humanistic slant to things, given their own philosophical training at the university. And so as an example, Bartolomé de las Casas, the person who the Spaniard, I should say, who most criticized Spain's colonial endeavor, also trained at Salamanca. And had a very different perspective than, say, the conquistadors did who were here. But it's important to also remember that Mesoamericans had their own institutions of education. In fact, the Aztecs had compulsory education, which was quite rare in this moment in history 500 years ago. And there was a two-tiered system that you can see on the upper left. There was the House of Youths, Telpochcali in Nahuatl, that everyone was available for, everyone had access to. And that school, we probably would say, was more along the lines of civics. Some people have compared it to like the Eagle Scouts or something along those lines, but also engaged with the ritual life of being an Aztec. It engaged with historical narratives, often oral traditions. The words of the elders is the literal translation of the oral tradition in Aztec society. On the top then was a different school that was for nobles, for the children of nobles, but also for commoners who exhibited some aptitude, like that they could join the priesthood. And that one is called the House of the Lineage. And so those two different institutions of education existed within Aztec society. And when you look at the bottom left, we can also see from murals at classic Maya sites that there were scribal training centers much earlier, pushing back into the first millennium BCE. So both these traditions drew on their own histories and trained them formally and socialized their youths into being members of society and what appropriate action was in those cases. Okay, so there's the deep backdrop of these encounters. Now moving to the Spanish-Aztec War, or the conquest or invasion led by Cortez. You can see on this map that there were a couple other earlier incursions by Spaniards in the 2 years before Cortez launched his in 1519. And these are interesting in that Cortez was also not authorized to lead a military excursion. He did not have that title, the front man, that developed in the Reconquista era of Spain. That was the governor of Cuba, a person named Velazquez. And that's the reason that Cortez was writing letters back to the king. He had breached the chain of command, and he was trying to justify to Carlos that his actions were warranted and that would bring riches for Spain. And that's, when you read those letters, you need to remember the author's intent and how he was trying to justify his illegal military action. But I'd like to introduce another character here that you can see in the figure. This is Malintzli, or Marina, or Malinche. She goes by many names, but she was the translator, the key indigenous woman who lived in this borderland between the Aztec and the Maya world. And she spoke both Nahuatl, the Aztec language, as well as Yucatec Mayan. Now, it just so happened that there was a Spaniard who had been marooned on the Yucatan Peninsula and knew how to speak Yucatec Mayan. So because of this, there could be this long translation from Castilian Spanish into Mayan and then into Nahuatl. And this is how this encounter was first linguistically navigated. Heading inland from the coasts of what's today is Veracruz, this is where there was encounters with Totonacs, and the Totonacs are a native group still in this area in Veracruz. And they were the ones who suggested to Cortez that they could find enemies of the Aztecs in Tlaxcala if they walked inland, and they acted as scouts, bringing them to Tlaxcala. Now, just as one sidebar before leaving, Cortez scuttled his boats. And now in later narratives, this became a heroic, almost Caesar crossing the Rubicon type moment, where there was no turning back. Now, this is an embellishment. And in fact, now there is a Mexican team doing underwater archaeology in this area, and they have identified 3 candidates that seem to be the 3 boats. They were anchored off the shore. They've recovered the anchors, including wood that is from the Cantabria region of northern Spain and radiocarbon dated to the late 15th century. So all of that matches the scuttling of these ships. And so Cortez actually had all of the fixings saved, and he had a boat builder with him named Martin Lopez, who would then reassemble boats to attack the Aztec island capital in central Mexico. But before that, they would come to the lands of Tlaxcala. And so the Tlaxcaltecs, in many sense, are Aztecs. They would say their ancestors were from Aztlan, but this nomenclature has gotten messy over the years. In fact, the people we call Aztecs never called themselves that. But their enemies were the Mexica, the ethnic group that dominated Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire. And they had a very different form of urban and political organization. And that's recently been mapped by archaeologists. So here is a map by my colleague Lane Farger and others who mapped Tlaxcala. And you can see it's this patchwork of terraces, and those black spots are plazas. It's a very different polycentric type organization to a city than we see for the Aztecs. Now, one of the parts that I've worked on is where exactly the Totonacs and Spaniards came from Veracruz into these lands. And this with one of my former students, Laura Heath Stout, who did a master's thesis on the ceramics at a site that we know historically called Tecoac. And when you look at the distances that Cortez and another conquistador account, Bernal Diaz, reference, The only thing that could fit is this general area from where they were coming from and coming into Tlaxcala. And we do have ceramics from this era, and we think that this site is an outskirt of Tecoac. So the Tlaxcaltecs in the 16th century depicted themselves as always very loyal to the Spanish crown. And they made this wonderful document that's called the Lienzo de Tlaxcala that has all of this history, this illustrated history of these encounters, including this is the entry to what we just saw into those lands around Tecoac. And then this is providing provisions later on in the Aztec-Spanish War. But when we look at some other documents, we can get a sense that this wasn't always a peaceable encounter. In fact, so this is another document that comes just east of there called the Huamantla map that has this encounter rendered very differently. It's a very bloody scene here of fighting between Spaniards and native people after a gift-giving event. So there's a little mix of the narratives here. And when we read the accounts more carefully, we can see that the Tlaxcaltecs battled the Spaniards for at least 20 days. And so here on the bottom right, this is a illustration made by an artist collaborator, Rafael Mena, of this debate. This was a debate between the leading figures of Tlaxcala of whether they should make an alliance with these newcomers. And their thinking in being part of a political system that had this sort of more indirect control was that if they showed their value to these newcomers, they'd essentially be left alone and they'd be given their own autonomous state, and they'd win their freedom from the attacks they were experiencing from the Triple Alliance or Aztec Empire. Another colleague on the top right that's his image, Aurelio Lopez Corral, who's a Mexican archaeologist, and he's identified and excavated and restored the stronghold for the city of Tlaxcala, which is in the north of the city. You can see on the map that's to left, that particular part called Tepeticpac, which was the stronghold and from which that they resisted the Triple Alliance armies. After the alliance was made, the now force of 500 or 600 so Spaniards, including actually Tainos from the Caribbean and a few African descended peoples, with now thousands, maybe even low tens of thousands of Tlaxcaltec warriors, crossed over into the basin of Mexico and would have seen something like this coming down the volcanoes. Here you have one of the conquistadors quotes Bernal Diaz de Castillo, where he's using that historical memory and purposefully evoking this sort of dream or mythical vision that from works of chivalry, like Amadis of Gaul, which was a popular chivalric book of its time. But you can see this, the island capital, which was larger than any in Europe at the time, maybe except for Paris, which were probably about the same size, about 200,000 people or so, but much larger than anything in Spain. Seville was under 100,000, larger than London. It was a very populous dual city of Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco. You can see with a lot of hydraulic engineering to bring fresh water into this city through aqueducts, bring out prevent flooding from a dike system that you can see to the right or east, and the system of causeways to access the city. Now, I won't go into all of the details, but the Emperor Moctezuma welcomed this force into the city where they resided for a few months before the Spaniards, before the Aztecs or the people of Tenochtitlan expelled this force from the city. In what has been known historically as the Noche Triste, or the sad night, that of course is a Spanish perspective on these events, but it also was an act of resistance on part of the Aztecs. And then also after another battle in Otumba that you see on this map over here, there was a caravan that came out of this one particular event that was captured and sacrificed, and their skulls left on a skull rack at this site called Tecoaque, Zultepec, Here, Enrique Martinez and Ana Jarquin are the two Mexican archaeologists who have, over the last 10 to 15 years or so, excavated at this site. So there are a lot of new discoveries that are filling in many events of this encounter. The Tlaxcaltecs and Spaniards regrouped, and they used those fittings that Cortez had from the boats, and they assembled brigantines, small ships that had falconets or small cannons on top of them. And this allowed them to then launch a naval battle. Now, something that's important here is that the naval battle was launched from Texcoco. Texcoco was the second most important Aztec city after Tenochtitlan, and it was the second state of what we call the Triple Alliance or Aztec Empire. So by this time, the Acolwa, which is the ethnic group of Texcoco, had splintered off. They had decided to join the Tlaxcaltecs and the Spaniards and allow their city to be used as a port to launch this naval battle. There also was a siege. So this here, we're getting into military technology, siege technology, cutting off aqueducts, encircling the city, trying to starve out the city, using naval power, using cannons. This was all, the arms race that had accrued over millennia in Eurasia being wrought on the Americas to cultures that were not familiar with those forms of fighting. Of course, the downfall, and I should mention the important graph that you see on top left over here, during these events in 1520, in the middle of these events, the first pandemic struck in Mexico and devastated the population. And then there are later ones that you also see registered here in the 16th century, but that first one also served to destabilize populations. And so the legacy of both extraction of resources, so for instance, gold resources, and here on the bottom, this bullion that you can see, archaeologists think was lost during the expulsion of the Spaniards from the city in that so-called Noche Triste. On the left, there's one that was probably going to be melted down, but thankfully the boat sank. But you can see a little stamp here that was where it was dedicated to go back to Spain. So of course, the legacies of this encounter are seen especially in downtown Mexico City and the two former city-states of Tlatelolco on the left, where the last Aztec emperor Cuauhtemoc surrendered on August 13th, 1521. And then, of course, Tenochtitlan, now the center of Mexico City. You can see the cathedral. And the layering on top now of a new colonial order. So, for instance, you can see the National Palace is on top of Moctezuma's palace. But really interestingly, some of those schools, so the Telpochcali on the left of those two arrows, the first university in Mexico, the University of Mexico, I just was at what has become of it, now called the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or UNAM, last week. But the original building was put over what archaeologists think was the Telpochcali, or the House of the Youths. And then there was also the House of the Lineage in front of the Temple Mayor, along with other religious buildings, a skull rack, the ball courts. And then in Tlatelolco on the left, you see some of the scribal training centers developed by the Franciscans, people like Bernardino de Sahagún, who had this trilingual discourse in Castilian, Spanish, Latin, and Nahuatl. This, of course, started the creation of a new order that we would call syncretic. And here, the subtitle for my book was a nod to Gamio's earlier work of forging New Spain, of creating a new Spanish order that blended all of these elements that we've seen develop over time. So, for instance, this aqueduct, which is not far from where I work in Teotihuacan, is Roman in style, but it has a Christian chapel in the center, and it was built by indigenous labor using techniques such as adobes that were from Mexico. And so it's really the fusion of these different cultural traditions. We see this especially in religious spaces. So native peoples of Mesoamerica weren't accustomed to going into buildings for religious service. Rather, those were done in the plaza outside of temples. And so because of that, the Franciscans and other orders needed to adapt, and they created these open chapels. People like Peter of Ghent, one of the first Franciscans, developed this scheme that really drew on Mesoamerican traditions of quadripartite divisions, four-way divisions. So for instance, on this top image, you're looking at a pre-Hispanic codex that has this quincunx, or 5 points, the cardinal directions plus the center. And when you look at these atria of the early colonial period, you see that very layout with the open chapels so that mass could be conducted outdoors. But you also see this in texts. Once native peoples and their descendants were able to write in Castilian and Latin, they developed advocacy in those languages. And so, for instance, going back to that first book that really introduced me to these ideas, Diego Muñoz Camargo, in this passage, I really like because it's tying back to some of those themes from the beginning. So he's talking about the pillars of Hercules, and that people thought that one couldn't go past them. Spanish monarchs, of course, adopted this logo, plus ultra, meaning we went beyond this, what was thought to have been the end of the known world. And here, this Nahuatl-speaking 16th century indigenous chronicler is now trained in those traditions, but also leveraging them. He brought this history of Tlaxcala on a boat the other way. He crossed the Atlantic eastward and brought this to Philip II, then the King of Spain. And finally, this, of course, is an event that resonates in many different ways in Mexico today, and was commemorated in different ways, of course, somewhat impacted by the pandemic. But so to commemorate the quincentennial since these events, there's been the creation of a model of the Temple Mayor in the main plaza in front of the cathedral, and also the rethinking and renaming in certain cases of certain key places. So for instance, over here on the top left, there's the mayor of Mexico City, who is changing the name of what was called the Plaza of the Sad Night, or Noche Triste. And this tree is supposed to be where Cortez cried under after the Spaniards had been expelled from the city, to the Plaza of the Victorious Night. So embracing a Aztec resistance narrative rather than the Spanish side of this having been a sad night. And then also at the federal level, the president has commemorated 2021, along with other events, playing a little loose, I should say, with the dates. So for instance, Tenochtitlan was founded in 1325, we believe, based on the chronicles, not 1321. But in any case, there's this very Mesoamerican tendency to make the dates fit so that there are nice cycles of time. And so this, of course, will still resonate today, especially in Mexico, but it has bigger repercussions for the world as we know it, in linking Europe to the Americas, to Asia. Those expeditions to the Philippines left from Mexico, and in many cases also included the Tlaxcaltecs and other native peoples along with that in the creation of the modern world. So there's a pretty quick and brief overview of a few thousand years of history and a lot of topics. I hope at least that it's been given you some things to think about, and that you might have any questions for me, which I'd be happy to answer.
David, thank you very much for a monumental sort of overview of all that history, well, dual histories and how they came together, and that was just a wonderful sort of way to set the problem. Now, let's just see if we have a question in the. There's one question in the Q&A. David Graeber and David Wengrow discussed Tlaxcala in The Birth of Everything. Do you agree with their interpretation?
So I was fortunate to participate in a conference in the fall that was at Brown that David Graeber was at, and we have corresponded about many of these things. And you know, I commend both of them on that monumental work, which what I think the real value is getting us to think about different pathways in human history. So, you know, I mentioned, you know, sort of more techno-deterministic narratives in thinking about the deep past. So like the idea that where we are now is inevitable, that this is, you know, that this eventually we were going to be here. And I think the more history that I read, the more I see that there are these potential different pathways, or these potential forks in human history. And so, and I think that book does a lot to highlight those possible different ways of organizing people. So, you know, I've worked for years in Tlaxcala. I've mostly worked on earlier periods, but I've had to be fascinated by the post-classic, or the, you know, the contemporary with the Aztec period. And a lot of my close colleagues, like whose work I showed, people like Lane Farger and Aurelio Lopez, have worked on these topics. I do think, so when Cortez came to Tlaxcala in his second letter that he's writing back to the King of Spain, he likens Tlaxcala to Venice and Genoa, and it says, this is a republic. This is different. It's like the Northern Italian oligarch republics, we might call them, of the Renaissance period. He wasn't a monarchy. So we have his words on the matter, but again, I'm always skeptical of the written word. I'm an archaeologist, of course, it's in my nature. But now that we have the actual mapped city, we can see that it wasn't dominated by, say, a single palace like you would expect in a monarchy or more monarchical society. Rather, it's this network of interconnected terraces and dispersed plazas. And so I do think that on the ground, we also see signs of what I would call a more pluralistic social organization. And I say that as an ex-political science major who has always been fascinated by issues of governance. Pluralistic meaning that there are more decision makers. So we have texts from Tlaxcala talking about the sorts of rituals that leaders would have to go through. Basically, they, you know, took these vows of service to the community that could last a year, where they were living in the temples and they were fasting and they were, taking oaths of office that seem unduly hard. I don't even know how many of our politicians would put up with them today. So I'm impressed by that, and the ability that there seems to have been accountability of leaders. There was a governing council that we might call a Senate that had at least 200 members, maybe 400, and could allow non-nobles access to it. So in many ways, it was this more democratic type organization. And we are actually seeing that in different parts of the Americas.
Thank you. Another question, whether you could maybe say a little more on humanism's role in pre- and post-conquest Mexico.
That's a great question. And so I should say I do have an administrative role at BU with the general education program. And I actually got a little interested in general education before, as a part of writing this book. And when I went to Spain, I went to the University of Salamanca that I was talking about, and I met with the librarian, and she showed me texts that they had that gives you the curricula all the way back into the 16th and late 15th centuries. And so you could see what works were being assigned for different career tracks. Joost, I know that you're a lawyer by training, but I also know that you are a humanist, you're part of this organization. But Cortez had a technical legal administration, education. He trained to be what was called in the time a letrado, a man of letters, but really what it was like to be a bureaucrat in this growing imperial system that was developing on the Iberian Peninsula. And so if you look at what they were reading, it's a lot of works of canonical law, Roman law. It's pretty functional. It's sort of to cultivate a legal mind and to be able to be literate, essentially. But it was more of a vocational education. And that's in contrast to the more humanistic education that the theologians were getting. And so when you look at what they were reading, they're reading classics, they're reading Thomas Aquinas, and they're reading Aristotle, and that's why people like Las Casas are having these debates about what is just war, what is the nature of humanity, do native peoples have a soul, and those sorts of debates that were happening in Spain in the 16th century. And I think having that richer education, having been exposed to works that are grappling with ethics and with philosophical inquiry, led them in a different direction. And it certainly shaped my thinking of what should go into a general education program these days, and how do we need those humanistic skills. And so I should also just add that that Salamanca school then came in some sense to the Colegio de Mexico. I mean, it came to the first university system in Mexico, and then was also part of creating a new 16th century new Spanish humanism within the Americas.
Yeah, that's fascinating. If I could just throw in the legal observation that a lot of what's later became international law started with the encounter with the peoples of the Americas, and the strand of the legal people versus the more ethically minded people. Both those strands were very important in the way that the law ultimately developed. So it's that history too is fascinating. I can't say I'm an expert in it at all, but the origins of current international law still lie very much in that experience.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, back to the Q&A. Are you familiar with the 1,000 or so Tlaxcalans joining the Juan de Onate settlers in 1599, moving across the Rio Grande and into what was to become the U.S.? They apparently settled in the Santa Fe area with the Spanish. Yeah,
that is fascinating history that I only know a little about. I've been to Santa Fe, and of course, when you go to the church of San Miguel Analco, the oldest historical church in that area, it does say right there that this was built by Tlaxcaltec Indians who came from central Mexico. And so, yes, the Tlaxcaltecs continued, and I am actually next week just giving a short on the Tlaxcaltecs. I won't talk in detail about that because it's actually not history I know too well, though I'm fascinated by it. But so they participated in a lot of incursions in the north. The case I know a little better, which is not in the US, but Saltillo, which you might know is in the northern Mexico state of Coahuila. They had a really pivotal role there, and that's actually commemorated in Tlaxcala itself, the monastery that expedition left from. And there is a barrio of that town that's called San Esteban Nueva Tlaxcala, so San Esteban New Tlaxcala. And people of Saltillo recognize the Tlaxcaltec contribution. So for instance, they make serapes, the weaving in Saltillo, and that was not native to that area. That was brought from central Mexico. They also make pan de pulque. Pulque is the fermented maguey wine or alcoholic beverage from central Mexico. And so they made a bread, and this is a wheat-based bread. So now, of course, it's a fusion of Tlaxcaltec things with Spanish bread brought to Saltillo. But perhaps the most amazing feat were the Tlaxcaltecs going to the Philippines. And so that incursion that left from the port of Acapulco, so it was fundamentally a new Spanish venture rather than, say, a Spanish venture. I mean, the port was Acapulco for the galleon trade. I have a colleague who's from the University of Barcelona, and she's worked in Guam. And when you go to Guam, they have metates, manos and metate. They have Central Mexican maize grinding tools and many other elements of this sort of hybrid material culture that included a Tlaxcaltec and other Central Mexican contribution. And of course, going into the Philippines, some Tlaxcaltecs fought with in those battles against the native peoples there, and then were involved in connecting Asia into the Americas. They would disembark in Acapulco, ship things through Mexico City and down the other side to Veracruz, and then off to Spain. And so that's what I see as like the indigenous Mexican contribution to globalizing the world. And in fact, one of my favorite native chroniclers, who's named Chimalpahin, in the early 1600s, is writing in Nahuatl about a Japanese emissaries coming to Mexico City and meeting with Spaniards. And so I feel like that moment, which is years before Jamestown or Plymouth, like when we think about US early history, Mexico City is already globalized. There is there are East Asians speaking with Europeans, and a native chronicler is writing that down in a native language. To me, that's true globalization.
We're at the end of the hour, unfortunately. Maybe I can put one more question to you, and then
sure.
The rest you will have those from the Q&A. Could you speak about the environmental conditions of Spain during the medieval period and the environmental conditions of the Americas after the Spanish invasion? Do you speak about that in your book?
I do a little, but yeah, so landscape was, I think, an active agent here, if you could phrase it that way. I mean, it shaped this encounter in different ways. For instance, many of these conquistadors came from Castile. They came from the high meseta, or the high plains of the central part of the Iberian Peninsula. And somewhat because of that, they were much more comfortable in the highland regions of Mesoamerica. And so where the colonial capitals were founded, like Mexico City, like Guatemala City, were in these environments that were more like what they were accustomed to. And so other environments like lowland tropical settings of, say, the Maya lowlands, the last Maya kingdom to be conquered by the Spanish wasn't until 1697. And so that's 150 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan. So that area was hard for them to navigate. The fact that the Maya were more politically decentralized also made it more complicated to subdue populations there. And so, in terms of colonial impacts, there are a few different things that I talk about in the book. I mean, one, I would recommend an earlier book that was called Plague of Sheep, which was about the arrival of sheep and goat in particular to the highlands of Mexico, and how they ate a lot of ground cover and caused mass erosion. And so that was one problem there. Another was the introduction of the New World had mosquitoes, but did not largely have the mosquito-borne pathogens that we associate with tropical lowlands today. So malaria, yellow fever, dengue, et cetera. Those, by and large, seem to have come over with, with both European and African populations into the Americas. And so areas that were once more salubrious, like the Amazon, like the Maya lowlands, started to have a high pathogen toll. And that also made the highland environments more desirable to live in, and explain some of the mass depopulation that you see in those more lowland environments.
Well, I apologize to the people who put in questions that we haven't had time to get to this evening, but it is meant to be the Archaeology Hour, and we're already over that hour. And I'd just like to thank David Carballo again so much for this tremendously rich presentation and equally rich responses to the questions. Thank you. I've just got a couple of slides to conclude, just to remind you that you can invite you to continue your connection with the AIA by becoming a member and by supporting the AIA and its programs. There is one more virtual lecture group beyond David's. David's continue. The second presentation of this topic would be tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And then on Thursday next week at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, he will be speaking, as you can see, on traitors or native conquistadors, the role of Tlaxcala in the fall of Aztec Mexico. And then Sarah Gonzalez from the University of Washington will be presenting both an archaeology hour, April 18th and 19th, and an archaeology abridged talk as well on April the 27th. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this evening. And again, thank you so much, David Carballo, for this, for giving us all a terrific evening.
Thank you all for tuning in. Take care.
Good night, everybody.